I think they're terrific. Welcome to the session. Thanks very much. I'm Tom Clark. I'm Canadian, which puts me at a disadvantage with everybody else here on the panel. I'm delighted to be here. Just a word before we start. The title that is in our program is, I would say, slightly misleading, and I will explain that in a minute. We could have called this session Droning On, but we won't, because it is a little bit more about that. I just want to point out before we start as well that I'm actually delighted that a majority of my fellow panelists here are actually pilots, and that includes myself. But I'm also a little concerned about it because, as you saw in that movie, the question now becomes, are the three of us who are pilots here, are we about to become, or are we already relics of a very quaint age where man or humans rode machines into the skies? It may all be over. I'm going to lay down just a few questions. There are many more to be talked about. But here's where I think what we want to discuss for the next hour. Are we truly entering sort of the Star Wars era, as we just saw on the film? Is this going to be a matter of machine versus machine, and may the best mechanic win? And we're going to take a look, we're going to talk about other forms of advanced technology. And the line, as you'll see in this discussion, between hardware and software is increasingly blurring a little bit. But what about other advanced forms of technology in the Star Wars era? Can it be used to deter, or in fact, as we're going to hear, can it be used to deflect and distract as well from conflicts? As I said, these are just some of the questions that are on the table, and they will evolve, and of course we'd like to get your input as we go into this as well. So what I'd like to do very quickly is introduce who we have on our panel. I've been looking forward to meeting all of these for a while. Missy Cummings, who was among the first U.S. fighter pilot in the history of that service. Female.
Female.
I thought that was rather obvious, but anyway, fair enough.
I'm not that
It's
old.
a problem, Missy, when I stop wearing my glasses. That's why, yeah, anyway. Missy is the Associate Professor of Aeronautics and Astronomics and Engineering Systems. She is the Director of the Human and Automation Lab at MIT, which sounds like something that Stephen King invented, and she has many other distinctions as well. I'm not going in order, but I want to introduce Neil Gershenfeld, also from MIT. He runs the Center for Bits and Atoms. His work is on display, has been on display from everywhere, from the World Economic Forum in Davos to shows in Las Vegas. And I will leave it up to Neil to explain how that works. Basically, when you take a look at what Neil has done in his life, if you have ever briefly imagined something, Neil's already written a paper on it. Jane Harman, who's sitting there. Many of you, of course, know Jane. Former congressman from the 36th District of California, 9 terms, 17 years in Congress, 2 separate times. She didn't get enough the first time, so she came back for more later. She is the head of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars. She has a couple of interesting awards. She served on the CIA External Advisory Board. She won the Medal for Distinguished Service from the Department of Defense, and she served and received numerous commendations and medals from the CIA, but unfortunately, I can't tell you about any of that. Edward Snowden, I think, has some information on that. General Jean-Paul Palomares from the French services. He is the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation of NATO. Prior to that, he was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force of the Republic of France. More importantly, as a fellow pilot, he flew 82 combat missions. In all, he has 3,500 hours of flight hours. And finally, I'll just say, I too fly. I fly a bush plane. I am a threat to absolutely nobody, except perhaps for a moose if he gets in my way. So let's move on to the discussion. And I want to start in a general way, we saw drones. This is sort of the new frontier a little bit. We're going to get to other advanced technologies in a moment. But let me start with this. In general, let me put the question to you. How long before manned combat flight is obsolete?
Well, I will answer with perhaps a short story, a true story, because we had very frightening images. Some months ago was a very striking, if I may say so, event that I'm sure the experts noticed. We saw a great picture of a wonderful, sophisticated drone landing very safely in the desert. Fine. And he landed through his autonomous recovery system. Excellent. Except that it landed in an unfriendly territory. It was the first defection of a drone. And this is true. So, first conclusion is at the end of the day, what matters is the human who programmed the drones, not the drone in itself. We have had the opportunity, and we are striving in ACT, in Allied Command Transformation, to provide the best technology, the most suitable, the most affordable, the most effective technology for those men and women who are in harm's ways in the theater of operation. And obviously the drones are part of that. And we have improved dramatically our ability in protecting people, in making more use in improving the precision, improving the persistence with 24/7 capability, surveillance, which improve, in addition, the situation awareness and then the efficiency. And obviously, and to come to your question, there are many challenges in getting further. First and foremost, the complexity. How we, and I'm sure that Missy will touch upon that, how we integrate the man in the loop to make sure that he keep control, understanding what happens. Obviously, there are a further challenge, which is the overflow of information, how we deal with that, how we can cope, because the overflow of information could lead to poor intelligence if we don't get the smart people to do that, to really use this information, to utilize this information. And so, at the end of the day, to come to your question, I think that the drones will not change the nature of the war by itself. The human will still be the key for human interaction. And as we get more and more people on this earth, at the end of the day, we need those skilled people not only to program, not only to control, not only to take the best out of this technology, but to use at the best their keen qualities. I mean, social and emotional intelligence, creativity, thinking, intuition, improvisation. And where will it be a real unmanned platform in the future? It's still to be debated, but at the end of the day, not a single technology will relieve operational commander from their responsibilities.
I want to go to Missy for the next thing, who was incidentally among the first female fighter pilots in the U.S. Air Force. Just so we're clear on that. Missy, you wrote something that really caught my eye, and just following on what the General was saying, that the nature of conflict and warfare is going to be substantially changed because of this, a cell phone, a smartphone. And you're looking sort of over the horizon a little bit and saying that, if I get you correctly, that we will be seeing battlefield conditions where soldiers can literally pull out the phone, go to the proper app, and call in air support, something that is incredibly complicated to do now on the battlefield.
Yes, these missions are actually under development right now. DARPA has a program where they're looking at how to actually call in forward air controller, replace a forward air controller with a smartphone. The Marine Corps is looking at developing a smartphone app to bring in a casualty evacuation, and the Army and medical evacuation helicopters. So the smartphone technologies, I'd like to tell you it's complicated, but my lab that this is what made my lab famous and got me on the Colbert Report, was developing the smartphone app to control any drone. And I would put it to the general, I've been after Airbus for years to let me control an Airbus with the smartphone, which it technically can, right? So that technology, I'd like to tell you it's futuristic, but it's really achievable today.
It's here. And Jane, that leads me to your area of expertise, and that is the question of policy. We are at the stage, as we've heard from Missy and the General, of an enormous change in, and at the moment we're just confining ourselves to talking about conventional combat, in a sense. I want to go beyond that in a minute. How are governments dealing with the whole issue of how to develop policy, whether it be internal or external, to deal with these new realities?
Badly. First of all, you pointed out, Neil, that I was a repeater in Congress. I served for 3 terms, left for 1, and then came back. So brain cell depletion is a problem that I have, so I want everyone not to take me very seriously. But I would argue that most policymakers, well, I don't know if it's, yeah, still, are not digital natives and have very little connection to technology except through their kids, and are ill-equipped to make decisions about how technology should and should not be used. Let me just make a couple comments about drones, for which there is almost no policy. I mean, John Brennan, when he was in the, just talking about from the US angle, John Brennan, when he was in the Obama White House, asked to come to the Wilson Center, which I had, to sketch out a kind of framework for drones. But it has not evolved into a U.S. law. I think there are ways we could do that that would piggyback it on other things like our Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which has a regulatory framework for surveillance, and I think drones are a form of surveillance in addition to being a weapon. But at any rate, I think we could do that, but we haven't done that, nor is there any international convention or consensus about the use of drones. But my point is, if you just went to Congress and said, okay, so do something, it would be a very feeble effort. And I think the use of drones at the moment is somewhat misunderstood. I did see the scary Star Wars movie. Again, I don't pretend to be a technical expert, but I have watched personally how drones are used by our government. We finally acknowledge that we use them, and we use them extremely carefully. And they claim that there is a high number of civilian casualties, at least with respect to any drone strikes by the US government, is not true. I don't mean that there never is a civilian casualty, but there's right now a dispute about a drone strike in Pakistan and whether or not a madrasa was hit in an area outside the tribal areas. And our government claims that did not happen. At any rate, point I finally want to make is that from a policy point of view, regardless of the technology, I think policymakers have to consider whether the use of some of these technologies, at least in a war context, helps or hurts. And an Israeli scholar that I met recently talked about the Boomerang Effect. And you all know what a boomerang is. That actually could be a weapon of war too, but a low-tech one. When you throw it out there, it comes back with increased force. And so you have to ask the question about drones and other technologies. Are we helping our cause, or are we creating more enemies against us by using this particular technology? And at least, I don't mean that answers every question about drones, but it is a question I think should be asked. And last thing, 70 countries now have drone technology. I think at least 5 know how to weaponize drones. And if we have absolutely no rules of the road, this is, we could expect maybe next year at the Halifax International Security Forum to have a drone from country, make it up, overhead here somewhere, doing whatever that drone may be doing, directed by a human being or not, on a fool's errand. But that is a future that scares the heck out of me.
Yeah, and I might just quickly add, from a Canadian perspective, we do have American drones over Canadian border points. So we kind of know how Pakistan feels. But Neil, take us into this world that Jane was just describing. This world where technology becomes ubiquitous, where everybody has more or less that capability. Describe what that world looks like.
So I'd like to zoom out in 3 brief steps around the drones. I work on the machines that make the scary machines. And so the first step is there's a digital revolution coming in fabrication. You understand digitizing communication gave us the internet. Digitizing computing gave us PCs. Manufacturing is still analog because the computer has a design, but the materials don't. The revolution coming is digitizing fabrication where you actually put codes and information into the materials themselves. That's a 4 billion-year-old idea. It's how molecular biology works. We're now learning how to do it from making integrated circuits to jumbo jets. It's not 3D printing as it's covered today, which is a strange meme, but there is a real revolution coming. In turn, the implication, the second step, is it means anybody can make essentially anything. So very literally, very seriously, we're working on machines that make machines, rapid prototyping of rapid prototyping machines, machines that can replicate themselves. It's a very serious research project. If machines can make machines, the second step in this scaling is it means the role of everybody in the room of controlling technology is gone. It's just, there are no control points. Access to advanced technology is no longer protectable or controllable. It's just sort of an inevitable implication of this recursion of technology creating technology. But rather than that being frightening, we found something really surprising. As outreach, so the research we're doing is maybe 20 years to the Star Trek replicator. But the internet wasn't invented after the iPhone. It was invented in the mini computer era. By analogy, we started setting up field versions of the technology I'm describing that's like the mini computer era, and they went viral. There's hundreds all around the world. But many of them ended up in conflict zones, in Afghanistan, in shooting wards, in shanty towns, at the Protestant-Catholic boundary in Northern Ireland, in Egypt, exactly because hurting people is a well-met market need. You don't need these tools to get access to weapons. They're on street corners everywhere. What we found is access to the advanced technology was being used by everybody else. Like during the last round of rioting, one of these labs I'm describing to do digital fabrication is in Giza. During the last round of rioting in Egypt, we called Concerned. And they laughed and said, "Are you kidding? It was one of our best days in the lab," because the sort of bright, innovative kids who have no interest in bashing heads came to the lab to get some work done, and nobody bothered them. It was a very productive day. And so we're finding nobody is on the beat of advanced technology to not fight wars, but access to these tools sort of hits head on jobs, education, infrastructure, sustainability. And so there's this very interesting recursion of the technology roadmap means people like this in the room lose control of technology, but it's a great opportunity for addressing some of the really fundamental root causes of conflict.
And General, where does that leave an organization like NATO, following on what Neil was just saying, that when this technology is ubiquitous, when it is self-replicating, the old handbook about how to deal with conflict and conflict resolution goes out the window, doesn't it?
Well, firstly, considering the piloting Airbus from a digital phone, I wonder what would happen if when the phone goes on standby. Could be a good point. But this kind of questions that we have in hands. What's next, I would say? How we capitalize on the technologies, the best technology which are available today, and how we make them friendly to our people, how we train, how we educate those people. We have in NATO a very interesting process which we call the interoperability, the standards, the standard agreements. And we try to, between the 28 countries, 27 countries, we try to reach an average level of standardization, which means of introduction of new technology. And this is more and more a challenge because you have the high end, I would say here in the US. And we have a lot of countries which try to keep with this momentum, and others which cannot. So how we enforce the interoperability to make sure that the day when we need all these forces working together, as we've seen in Libya, in Afghanistan, and we have 2 decades of operation behind us, so we have a lot of experience. That means that the solution is sadly that we work closer and closer with the different words, with the science and technology words, with the industry, with the operational requirements word. And that's exactly the aim of a like command transformation. It's to connect all these words together, to make the best out of the technology, to make them affordable, sustainable, and effective. Because the finest technology could be useless on a certain territorial operations. We know that, even if we pay that quite a lot of money.
Missy, that brings up an interesting point. If everybody is seeking the technology for advantage, and once everybody has the advantage, can you say then that nobody has the advantage?
I thought this was an interesting point when you said 70 countries. No, it's actually every country. Every country, there's a website you can go to right now called Do It Yourself Drones, DIY Drones. And every country can have, if they don't, they can, and every country can go buy Parrot personal UAVs from France over the internet. And so it is a technology that is in everyone's hands. And I think sometimes what the military is not seeing coming yet, but I know is very much in the works. You know, we have our UAVs, the enemy is building their own UAVs, and now there's a new third party, which are human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. They have actually just figured out that they can start leveraging this technology to help their cause too. And so what I think in the new battle space is we're going to have lots of eyes in the skies and lots of recordings of events on the ground. And I think we're about to move into a strange new kind of accountability in warfare of, you know, whose sensors are telling what about what story.
But I think it's more complicated than that. And you are right that 3D printing I don't know if it's a misnomer or not, pardon my, you know, digital ignorance. But at least what I read is soon, or maybe now, we can make guns on 3D printers, and maybe we'll make drones pretty soon with 3D printers, or maybe we'll do something even more advanced with no rules of the road. And everyone, not just nation states, but NGOs and bad guys having access to this technology. I think it's terrifying, because drones don't just watch. Drones also can launch weapons. And if anybody can do that against anybody else, I think game over.
I agree, except I would just want to, you know, it is a substantial leap in technical prowess to go from a flying camera in the sky to something that can launch a weapon and deal with a recoil effect. I mean, there's some basic physics principles in actually how you fire a weapon. It has to be a certain size, it has to have a certain velocity. And so for those kinds of more complex systems, I don't think, even if you have a 3D printer, you would have to be a fairly sophisticated country to have a weaponized UAV. But that being said, any UAV that you can buy off the internet right now could be capable of biochemical warfare. Mm-hmm. And that is something else that certainly we as countries, both externally and internally, need to be worried about as threats. But I think that drones themselves are going to become more and more of an equal opportunity technology that allow people to tell their version of a story. There are many, many other applications, certainly in warfare, but I think that is one that is going to start becoming more of an issue. And of course, it depends on what side of the fence you sit as to whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, I think there's a very close instructive historical analogy. Around 128 in Boston, the whole computer industry was there. Wang, Prime, Data General. Many of you might not have heard of any of them. They all failed, every single one. And it was when PCs appeared. And Ken Olsen, the head of digital, famously said, "Nobody needs a computer in the home. Those were toys, we'll do the serious stuff." That's the moment we're at right now. You know, the world's might gathered here can look at this and say that's a toy. DIY drones is a great example. If you look at the cost structure, the time to develop the drones, the speed, the agility, it just blows away military acquisition. So you can look at it as a toy, but that's exactly the story of mainframe companies looking at PCs. That's the script we're repeating. But interestingly, if you looked at how that played out in the chaos of the emergence of the internet, there were lots of fears of secrecy and control and things like that. And so there was attempts to make crypto systems that themselves were secret, that were easily broken. There was digital rights management and copy protection. All of those things failed. It turned out the only real security that works for the internet is transparency. that being able to see the code, being able to see what other people doing emerged as the model that's sustainable. So you can't protect the information as a scarce resource. You provide incentives to make it buy and sell and share it. If you look at stealing software or music, what ended up being most effective against that was making it more convenient to not do it. So transparency and incentives to opt in is what worked in the transition from mainframes to PCs, and I suspect something very, very similar will play out in this story.
I'd like to explore that a little bit more. I mean, it reminds me of a Tom Lehrer song years ago, The Ballad of Wernher von Braun. You know, he says, I make the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. In that we're creating this technology, and you've all described how it is now so widespread, but let's deal with that very area you were talking about, and that is, how do you actually accommodate it? How do you neutralize it if that's what you want to do? How do you make it safer for everybody if everybody's got these things?
Again, from the policy perspective, and maybe from the American policy perspective, our policy is going the other way. Not toward more transparency, but toward more privacy protection, whatever that may mean, and more insistence, and there is certainly legislation pending in Congress, whether it happens or not, that you forbid the use of drones, certainly domestically over the U.S. That's one of the current debates. Our Federal Aviation Administration is about to license drone technology to anybody in about 3 or 4 years. And that is terrifying to many states and national policymakers, and they're trying to legislate the fact that you need a warrant, a court warrant, in order for a drone to surveil a person or a house. Our Constitution works that way. And I mean, it's kind of easy to say, if you don't do that, if you go in this transparent direction, I understand the benefits of it, and I understand technology driving it that way, but then you shred our Constitution in many respects. You also very much reduce the importance of the nation state. If you have technology that can fly anywhere, and let's not just talking about drones, but basically operates in ones and zeros, what difference does it make if there is a Canadian border with the United States?
And General, from a military point of view, following on what Jane was saying, that the civilian governments can license drone usage, whether it be commercial or obviously military applications. But what about interdicting them in a military sense? Is that even possible?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is a risk of confusion about the tool and the employment of the tool. And we must remind ourselves that so far, and related to your first question, what we have are remotely pilot vehicles. There is a pilot somewhere. There is a pilot somewhere, which clear rules of engagement, clear mission, precise mission, and he has the means to achieve precise mission. That's one point. Secondly, we have more or less employed drones in, I would say, benign environments so far, more or less. There is no real introduction of drones, of UAVs, RPAs, in a very strained, high level of threat of environment. And being a fighter pilot, I would be delighted to go for drone hunting, like my predecessors in the Second World War. That will be very easy for the time being. Would you agree on that?
I would agree with the current technology that's deployed operationally today, but even Israel has said in 40 years, Israel will be completely unmanned in terms of fighter bombers. And there was an important event that occurred 1 year ago in terms of safety records. Last year, it became more safe for the United States to send an unmanned aircraft on a mission than a manned fighter or bomber. So the safety record of a robot in that application is more safe than human flight today. And that is actually without any specific organized safety efforts. So the technology is getting better and better, and we're certainly working on the air-to-air component, which were my favorite missions as a fighter pilot. I hate to admit it, but they're very rule-based, and they're also very, I as a human inside the cockpit limit the aircraft. I can pull the aircraft so quickly that I will lose consciousness. Computers don't have to worry about that. Computers don't have to go to the bathroom. Computers don't crash on the back of the carrier at 3 a.m. because of fatigue. So I think that it is coming. There is research in development right now to do fighter attack, fighter to fighter, and the close air support missions. It will happen. The question is when.
Neil, can I just take you down a slightly different path here, because we're talking about advanced technology. We've been talking almost exclusively about drones, but there's a lot more out there other than drone technology that is going to change forever the way that rebels think and that armies act. Take us down that path a little bit and give us some idea.
Sure, so let me explain this core concept of analog and digital to understand, because what I'm about to then describe will go from molecules to jumbo jets. Telephones got worse with distance. Claude Shannon wrote the best master's thesis anybody's ever written. He was at MIT, and in his master's thesis, he essentially invented digital. And the heart of what he showed was what's called a threshold theorem. And what that meant was if you have a code word and you send symbols, as the code word gets bigger, the error goes down as the exponent of the size of the code word, which means really, really fast. And that meant you could have imperfect hardware, but you could communicate perfectly. Until he did that, engineering was imperfect, errors accumulated. He showed you could communicate perfectly with an imperfect system. That's what gave us the internet. That's what digital means. John von Neumann did the same thing for computing. Computers were rooms full of gears and pulleys, and they got worse with time. He showed by computing with symbols, you can detect and correct errors, and so the computer could run as long as you want and compute perfectly. So that's the technical meaning of digital. Now, consider a child building with Lego bricks versus a 3D printer. With the Lego bricks, you don't need a ruler because the geometry comes from the parts. When you assemble it, you can detect and correct errors. So the tower is more accurate than the child. That's unlike how we build any technology today. When you're done, you don't put Lego in the trash, you disassemble it and use the parts again. Those are exactly what von Neumann and Shannon taught us. Now, 4 billion years ago, evolution discovered that. My favorite protein is the ribosome, and it builds you. You're full of molecular machines, and it builds you with molecular Lego. The research on the frontier of digital fabrication, so 3D printing, meaning squirting plastic, dates back to 1952. MIT made the first computer-controlled milling machine, and this is just now squirting instead of cutting. The real frontier is this idea of digital fabrication. So think Lego, but in one version, the Lego is microelectronic components. And so we're developing tabletop chip fabs, machines that make whole integrated circuits. In another version, making a Airbus jumbo jet is a 15-year, $15 billion investment that almost destroys the company. What we found is if you make Lego carbon fiber composite and you have insect-like assemblers doing exactly what I described, like the child with Lego, but now with carbon fiber, you can make materials much lighter and much stronger than any known material. But instead of the billion-dollar autoclave, you make it locally, you can correct errors, you can vary the size to match the mission. We have another project with looking at geoprinting, actually making geological scale features. And so once you digitize fabrication by putting codes into materials, it means you lose the billion-dollar autoclave and you can print airplanes. And it's a very serious work with the aerospace industry. You lose the billion-dollar chip fab and you can print integrated circuits, and it's very serious work with the IC company. And so essentially all of modern manufacturing is about to go through this transition of digitizing it. And it's an exact analogy. Digital communication and computation made it accessible, personal, and scalable. That's what's going to happen to manufacturing now. That's the technology. And it's not going to replace traditional industry, but like digital computing and communication, it's going to create all these new tiers of industry. And in particular, allow this very interesting sort of collaboration where you can send data that becomes things and things can become data. And so it's sort of literally an Internet of Things. That's the real revolution coming. And that's what leads to this opportunity of anybody being able to make anything. The military is very involved because it's going to make it faster, better, cheaper to make stuff. But the challenge I'd give everybody here is it also makes it faster, better, cheaper for everybody else to make stuff.
Yeah.
And that really changes. It's not just simply a different way to fight the same war. It changes very fundamentally how you think about why it is we do what we do.
Okay, so you come back to a Congress, a Parliament, which is analog. at best. No possible way. All the fascinating stuff you just said could, number one, be understood by 98% of the people there, but number two, feed into any coherent policy about what to do about funding a military, the rules of the road on declaring a war someplace, figuring out some longer-term strategy. There is total disconnect, at least for the moment.
So let me tell you a great microcosm of that. A friend who runs one of these digital fabrication labs in Barcelona. Barcelona in Spain is such a mess. I don't know who's here from Spain, but with 50% youth unemployment, they now run the city. The deputy mayor, the mayor, and the city architect all came from this digital fabrication lab. And the connection is basically civic society failed. There aren't jobs, governance, it's all broken. What they're doing is they're filling the city with these tools for digital fabrication as a core policy because quietly, this isn't a sectarian thing, just quietly they've seceded from Spain and Europe because they weren't helping much. And they're kind of reinventing a notion of a city-state around self-sufficiency. They want to be globally connected for knowledge, but locally produce what they consume. And so there's maybe a happy scenario of irrelevance for existing governance.
Yeah.
You can keep doing whatever you're doing, it's just no longer relevant to anybody anymore.
Personally, I got to say, I love a scientist who I can understand. I mean, this is great. Missy?
I'd like to follow up on the irrelevance. And what are we going to do about, what's Congress going to do? And I've got news for you. This is out of the government's hand. And I think we're at a very interesting point in time in terms of technological development. Up to now, most of the major technological advances have happened because of military funding, the internet, these types of things, where the military, the government invested a lot of money. They had the brain trust in the government labs or in the universities that were working for the government to have these developments come through. As an educator and as an engineer, one of my biggest concerns is we have lost the brain trust in terms of, and certainly in this nation, we do not have enough engineers, we're not training enough technologically competent people, much less brilliant people. But even at MIT and the other leading universities around the country and the world, when they graduate, they are not going into the government, they are not going into the defense sector, they are going into the commercial market. So what's going to happen is that these big new leaps in technology are actually going to happen outside of the military sphere of development. And students today, they're very smart, they're very savvy. They don't want to go into the military because there's no money in the military. There's no money to be made. They are interested in having a much broader reach. And so when you talk about what's Congress going to do about this, when you start talking about the business world and this is what's going to be driving all of these innovations, I'm not sure that Congress can do anything because now this is a global issue.
I know, but at some point, real people get hurt. Not virtual people, not robots, real people. And so if a government's responsibility is to provide for the common defense, and that's an oath that people who serve in the executive branch and the Congress take, what does that mean in this era of surging and fascinating technologies? And I agree you can't hold it all back, nor should you. The government used to be in the R&D business and got out of that business. And the private sector is way ahead of the government. And I'm sure that's true in other countries too, but I'm just talking about the US, which is what I know. I also know that not only do people not want to work for government anymore because it doesn't pay enough, they don't want to work in, for example, aerospace firms because the climate is so bureaucratic and stultifying. They'd much rather work in Google or somewhere else. So if they're not working in the defense world, and the private sector is developing other stuff, which has huge benefit for good, some people out there who want to hurt us, whoever us is, all the good guys sitting in this room, can take that same stuff and pervert it, not stopped by any government or any boundaries of a state, and use it to harm us. And then what?
So if I could, let me give you two examples of what I think are good policy responses. One is DARPA's been just dabbling in providing access to these tools, viewing the interest of kids in science and technology as a matter of national security. And I think that's really interesting. Not developing weapons, not going into the military, just kids being engaged in this world as part of our core national competence. So I think that is an interesting response from DARPA. There's a very interesting bill in Congress right now, written by half of the physics caucus, Bill Foster, to make a...
Who's the other half?
Russell. And Vern Ellen's retired. That's why there's 2, not 3. And the idea of that bill is to make a new national lab out of connected local labs, these field fab labs. And so we have national infrastructure providing these tools on a local scale for anybody to be able to make anything. And both of these I view as responses by sort of getting ahead of the curve by providing options to opt in, by engaging people in access to these tools as part of our national competence. I think it's a very interesting way to view our national defense as giving kids access to good tools.
I really want to go back to the general for a second, because what's been said here by Missy in particular is a couple of things. First of all, the best and the brightest are not going into government or into the military. This must be of a concern to you. And secondly, you're sort of the canary in the cage for developing whatever policies or rules around this new technology would be. Missy makes the point, and backed up by what Neil is saying, is that this technology is so vast and so fast that the idea of coming up with firm policies about it might in fact be impossible to do, but your job is to at least give it a shot. So with the deficit, with the human deficit on one side, and the near impossible task of trying to put your arms around this technology, where are you?
I'm very happy that you come on this point on the human perspective, because I think at the end of the day we could have called this panel Robot Wars, the human factor strikes back. Because this is the most essential part of that should be the most essential part of our focus. How to get, how to keep, how to motivate those young men and women to join our forces. And we dramatically need those skilled people, those that we can train, educate in the best way. So this is really the key. And taking into account this human factor, well, at the end of the day, we have to master the race for technology. This is my perspective. Firstly, because we have a dramatic reduction in defense budget. We have to think differently. And this is what this transformation is about, is to keep the age while keeping as well as a factor in line, and human perspective, budget perspective. So we must strike the balance. So, and if we go the technological route as it is today, how many systems would we be able to afford in the future? You know the rules and the law about that. So I will see the technology helping us to reduce the cost, to make it more affordable, more sustainable, to predict the cost of ownership of those equipment. And when I listen to this wonderful panel, we should be able to do that, provided that we have the will to achieve that. But it's exactly the next challenge. The human perspective and how we keep the age while keeping the cost, I would say, reasonable and under control.
I want to throw this out for some questions in the audience. Well, okay, there's quite a few. We're going to do this in a low-tech way. I will point to somebody, wait for the microphone to arrive, and please tell us who you are, and we'll take it from there. And because we're under time constraints, can I ask you, please, keep the comments or questions brief, and try and get to a question mark within 20 seconds. Let's start over here.
Hi, thank you. Dixon Osborne with Human Rights First. I wanted to suggest that the conversation about armed drones is a red herring. That the question really is about the use of lethal force. Drones are just a weapons platform. And lethal force is governed by whether we're at war or not. So if you're in a non-international armed conflict, you can use lethal force against the person engaging in continuous combat function, directly participating in hostilities. But if you're not in an armed conflict, then it has to be only an immediate and specific threat. So I think the real question here, which goes, I think, to Representative Harman, what you were saying in general, what you were just saying, is that we need to come to grips with where are we at war? And are we going to be at war over around the entire world against terrorists? And what kind of precedent is that setting for the United States right now for others in the future? Thank you.
Jane, why don't you pick up on that?
Well, I think that is the right question. Again, the old definitions are analog. Let's go back to that. Built on treaties and conventions and precedents that don't fit the way we do stuff anymore, or the way we will do stuff 10 minutes from now. And there does need to be a conversation around this. I think the one good thing about Snowden, I find his acts despicable. Some of you may disagree, but I think he stole some very important stuff, and it's damaging to the United States and to other countries. But the one good thing is a debate is now raging in the world about how, when we should do surveillance, under what circumstances. And that debate should have been had 10 years ago, so I'm glad we're having it. But I think there's no answer to your question until we have a real debate about wars of the future. And I don't think they are on battlefields with people wearing uniforms. They are much more subtle. And some kid using an internet, in the boonies of Yemen, maybe, with this technology, and Neil's brain, what's your name?
Neil.
Neil, yes. Neil's brain can do more harm than NATO.
Sir, right over here.
Oops.
And again, the briefer we can keep the comments or questions, the better off we'll be.
Sure. Hi, I'm Derek Ashong with Fusion, the ABC News and Univision joint venture. I feel like there's an elephant in the room given the title of this conversation, and I would really, really love someone to address it. I want to disagree with the general that I think that the question at hand is not what happens to the human element. The real question is what happens with the future of automation and the future of artificial intelligence that remove the human element. And it seems so often policymakers are thinking about these issues of technology after the fact. So we're now questioning the issue of lethal force long after the technology has been made possible. How are we going to deal when we haven't even been able to create any sort of framework for addressing how we apply lethal force when humans are still involved, to what happens in a world where humans do not need to be, and that appears to be relatively close around the corner?
Missy, this is something you think about every day.
Actually, I was just thinking, one of the reasons I left the military and went into research and got my PhD was because I knew in the mid-90s, when I saw F-18s land themselves on aircraft carriers by themselves better than I could. And on another part of the world, I saw the tactical Tomahawk missile bombing with more precision than as a bomber pilot that I could ever have. I knew computers would put me out of work. And that happened a year ago when it became safer to send a drone on a mission than me. So I would tell you, I think it's a larger question, not just within the military, but there's a big debate in the world right now. Automation is replacing a lot of people at work. But I would actually tell you that's the first derivative. The second derivative is it's changing the way our lives are. And so in a lot of ways, automation is creating a lot of jobs. But so there's two parts of your question that I heard is like, where are we in terms of automation taking over our lives? It's coming. I think your job is safe for now, but you never know. And but the other part of it I heard sort of in there was, what is automation in terms of lethal force? And that certainly is an issue. The United States government has come out with a document called the DoD 3000I that says, for now, we will not let drones or robots release weapons without human authority. And there are no other countries that I know of that have come out and stated that so clearly. So I think it was important for the United States to jump out ahead and put that in writing and say that, but it's clear, it's for now, and they leave open the possibility for change in the future. And I think that's an important aspect because, I'm from Boston. Everybody saw what happened in Boston last April. There are other people working on putting non-lethal forms of force on drones. And I certainly can say, as a person who was there when that was happening, I would have preferred to have a drone tase someone or do something with maybe a laser, a non-lethal laser, to stop what was happening. So when we start talking about putting lethal force on drones, either in other countries or in our own country, we have to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that, but I do agree with the red herring comment. Drones are just a platform. They are a very simple platform to launch a weapon. So we we need to disambiguate. Are we talking about a policy in terms of when it's appropriate to use lethal force, or are we talking about the actual capabilities of the technology?
General?
Yeah, I would like to come back on your point. I will not disagree 100%, but I would say that we need to be more mature in our approach to automation. And we must face, as you say, the reality of what we will be capable to do. And even so, we must take the best opportunity to change our concepts when it is needed. We have still very old, and I would agree, very old concepts in hands, costly, demanding in terms of human resources and so on and so forth. I mean, in doing, I would say, submarine, for instance, detection, these sort of things, there's a huge potential. We have some studies in that, and with a great potential. But on the other hand, I mean, automation is about predictability. And I would argue that we are not in a predictable world. So that's why I see that the nature of war is there. We'll still have fog and friction. We still have uncertainties. And you can ask yourself, what is the best tool to deal with uncertainties? From my perspective, it's still human. Could be disputable in 1 century from now, but that will be a very different world. And when you look all the debates, the wonderful debates we had today, and the wonderful panel, I would say we are very far from getting an automatic answer to the many crises that we are facing today.
I've got time for one more. We've only got a few minutes left. Right there, sir.
Hi, my name is Farah, and I am from Yemen, a country where your beautiful terminology come into test with regards to the drones. My hometown actually also was bombed by a drone recently, and I testified about it in the US Senate. And my question, actually 3 weeks ago, I want to share something with you very briefly. 3 weeks ago, I met a person in 30 minutes outside Sana'a where a drone strike hit his village and killed his brother by mistake, and another few people in a car. And he told me literally that he went into the car, so the body that could be handled the best, and he said, this is my brother's body. He didn't know if it was even his brother, it just that was something he could carry. And I'm astonished that from your conversation that the human factor was absolutely away. And when you spoke about the human factor, it's even, what does that mean in this side as a job or as not job? I'm still surprised I didn't hear what does this mean in the other side. And I have done extensive reporting about drones and research in Yemen. And I can assure you, I have seen it where this is one of the things that have empowered Al-Qaeda more than anything else. I have seen 2009, there was few hundreds members of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and now there is few thousands of them. I think it would be bizarre to just suggest that this is only because of the drones, but I am completely convinced, and I have seen in the ground, that drones were one of the most effective tools that empowered Al-Qaeda in Yemen. And I'm wondering whether, on a human level, on a pragmatic level, or even on a military level, have you ever thought if this is effective? We have seen completely the opposite, and we have seen your conversation, as much as I have seen it also in DC, so narrowed that speaking about what does this mean in a technical, I would say, dry terms, dry conversations that completely do not know what is happening in the other side of the world. Thank you.
Okay. Jane, I'm going to throw that to you.
That is what I meant early in my first statement when I talked about the boomerang effect. Are we ending up sending something out that, in fact, comes back to hurt us? And I think it is a fair question, whether the use of drones, and yes, drones have technically taken out many of the high-value targets from core Al-Qaeda. That has happened. But on the other hand, a huge number of people around the world are now much more anti-American than they were. And I don't know if it was your testimony, but somebody testified in the Senate that he loved America, and then there was a drone strike on his village, and he and the whole village turned against America because of that strike. Was that you? That was very powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead, Neil.
I'd like to follow with a question from that compelling description. We use our military to project advanced technology. We use aid to send bags of wheat. And there isn't much in between. My challenge to everybody gathered is how do we project tools, advanced technology that helps people? There's huge impact of the technologies we're describing in sustainability, jobs, education, in all these things we care about, but kind of nobody's on that beat. We project advanced technology to fight, and we send low-tech things as aid. We don't have a way to project advanced technology as aid. And for me, that's what we should be talking about. That's how to respond.
Well, certainly I don't want to leave you with the impression that in using force, would it be through drones, cruise missiles, or any kind, and I would suspect that drones are very much more precise and limit the collateral damages, if I may say so. They are. And there are proofs of that. Well, when they started the war in Afghanistan, we launched a lot of, the US launched a lot of Tomahawk missiles, and that was not the same precision, I can tell you, or even in Bosnia. But we can discuss that. But at the end of the day, there is a man or woman at the other end of the operational chain who assume this responsibility, which is a huge responsibility, like a fighter pilot with his bombs when he has to release the standoff weapons at, let's say, 10 kilometers or more than that. So the human factor is there, but it is about, and I fully understand the sensibility of the subject, but don't figure at any stage that the man or the woman who is in the loop doesn't assume this overwhelming responsibility of delivering forces against people. And if he does that, it's because he has orders, rule of engagement, and some certainties according to other sources, including human intelligence. Drone will be nothing without human intelligence. We must stress that again and again. And that's how I see the loop of the human factor closing with a good, proper, consolidated human intelligence helped by the best technology.
Can I just jump in here? We're nearing the end of our time. And I'd like a final thought from all of you. And can you frame it this way? What are we going to be talking about in this area in 5 years from now? What's the discussion going to be, Missy?
In terms of drones, the question will be what percentage of our force has gone that way? The Air Force now has more drones than it does manned aircraft. The other services will follow suit because it's certainly more cost effective.
General, what are you going to be talking about 5 years from now?
Will the use of force will be more effective, more controlled, and more efficient with the use of these new technologies?
Jane?
I'm actually impressed with what Neil just said and what was raised this morning by Rachel Kleinfeld, who also asked about using cell phones and technology for good purposes. Whether we leverage the power of technology to build opportunities for kids and project a narrative of our countries that is positive and helpful rather than scary and harmful.
Neil?
I'd like to comment with a challenge to the meeting. I'd like to come back in 5 years. If the meeting is about projecting advanced technology to make the world a safer place, if it was up to me, there's many more people I'd have in the room. There's the military, there'd be kids, there'd be community activists, there's creating infrastructure. There's a whole slew of people around technology is transforming society. I think if you take the question, the military, this is a great group. If you take the question, how technology can make the world a safer place, there's a much broader audience. So I would challenge the meeting, and I would be delighted to come back in 5 years for a more diverse version of the meeting with this group, but with all of these kind of other actors with how technology can help make the world safer.
Thank you. And on that note, Neil Gershenfeld, thank you so much for being here. Jane Harmon, great to see you again. General Palomeros, thank you so much. And of course, Missy Cummings, fabulous to have you here. First, incidentally, female fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And as is customary, it's nice to see Tom again. Let's give Tom a round of applause for moderating that session very well. And we're going for a coffee break, and it hasn't been, nobody's told me exactly when we're coming back, but they'll let you know. Okay. 10 minutes.